Well, Victoria's new opposition leader, John Pesutto, has declared everything is on the table as the Liberals consider dumping policies it took to last year's unsuccessful state election. In his first sit-down television interview since becoming Liberal leader last month, Mr Pesutto revealed he wants his predecessor, Matthew Guy, to remain in Parliament. I spoke with John Pesutto earlier this week. Well, John Pesutto, thanks for joining us on Sky News.
It's my pleasure, Simon.
So how are you going to turn the ship of the Victorian Liberal Party around?
We're going to rebuild. We're going to rebuild the organisational side of the party. After 3 election losses, that is not good enough. So we're going to have to rebuild that. We're going to have to rebuild our relationships with business throughout Melbourne and throughout Victoria and other stakeholders. So at an organisational level, at a party room level, we're going to rebuild and establish those relationships. We're going to connect more with the community. 3 election losses in a row tells you that we're simply not connecting well enough with the Victorian community. And so even in the few weeks that I've been in this job, I've been travelling around Victoria, and I'll continue to do that. And I'll spend less time in here, in my office, and more time out in communities talking to people, like my colleagues will be, to build on those relationships within our community. And we've learnt, not just in the recent state election, but in the federal election in May, that having strong community connections, candidates who connect with the people they want to represent, candidates who speak the language of the communities they want to serve, is the key to success. And you win the trust and confidence that way.
You say you want to rebuild. Rebuild was one of the words in the slogan that the last 2 Liberal Party leaders used before yourself. They wanted to recover, rebuild. Obviously, it was a reference to COVID there. But I guess, hasn't the party tried to rebuild and just hasn't worked? Is it time to throw the plan out completely and start again, start fresh?
Yes, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And I understand, Simon, that after 3 election defeats in a row, words alone can't do much to assuage the concerns, particularly of our supporters who want and expect, rightly, the party to be successful at elections. I want the party to be successful. I've been a member of the party this year for 30 years, but I promise you, we are looking at everything from the ground up. Everything's on the table, and we will try new things, embrace new strategies to reconnect with the Victorian community.
So what are some of those strategies? Obviously, you're the member for Hawthorn. A lot of people consider you John from Hawthorn. How do you bust that ideal and get out there?
Well, I actually grew up in country Victoria too, so I'm familiar with what life is like in regional Victoria, where the services aren't as plentiful as they might be in areas closer to the city. You don't have access to public transport like you do in Melbourne. You don't have access as readily to schools and hospitals as you do in urban areas. So I'm very familiar with that, and I have spent the early part of my leadership travelling around regional Victoria, and I'll continue to do that. But some of the things that we've got to do to make sure that our candidates and our messages reflect what the Victorian people are experiencing is pre-selecting earlier, making sure candidates have the time they need as endorsed representatives of the party to connect with those people, making sure that we're not leaving it to the last minute to raise vital funds, and making sure that our messages and the policies we announce, not just in weeks or months before the election, but earlier than that, are reflecting the priorities of the communities we're trying to represent. And that's a combination of general messaging, but also important local connections that candidates and the party will need to achieve.
So is that acknowledgement that candidates weren't pre-selected early enough and not enough money was raised for the last election?
I think we have to be realistic, and we're all collectively responsible. So that's the first thing I'd say. I'm a member of the party, so I'm responsible for that too. But as a party, we've got to look at the reality. We've lost 3 elections in a row. So clearly we're not raising enough. Clearly we're not pre-selecting as well as we can. We've got some great candidates, don't get me wrong, but we have had some issues with some, and that's what I'm really referring to. So we can't leave fundraising.
You're referring to people like Renee Heath or
not Renee, some other candidates over recent elections, certainly not Renee. I think there have been some other candidates where we've pre-selected and maybe some further diligence might have assisted. And my point is that we have to be realistic, and I want our viewers to understand that none of us in the party room that I lead and in the party that I lead are trying to sugarcoat anything here. We're trying to be as realistic as we can. The key to success in 2026 is being full and frank about what's happened in the last 3 elections and making sure we just don't repeat the mistakes.
Have you decided to scrap any of the policies that Matthew Guy took to the election?
Not at this stage.
Why not?
Well, there were some really well-received policies that we think really earned the trust and confidence and support of many sections of our community. So we'll look at everything, as I think people would expect us to do. I think our viewers and Victorians more generally would expect me as leader and my colleagues to look at what worked, what didn't, and then over the course of the next, particularly 2 to 3 years, as we work through what kind of priorities we want to take to the Victorian people in 2026, to then start making those announcements. But we're going to give ourselves the time we need, and I think people will be reasonable and understand that we'll need some time to work through that.
Where do you sit on integrity and IBAC at the moment? Because I know you have a bit of an intimate knowledge of it as a former Shadow Attorney General. You've also worked in the Napthine Value government when IBAC began. Do you think IBAC doesn't have enough teeth? Because we've got a number of reports that haven't come out yet, and they obviously, if they came out during or before the election campaign, things could have been different.
I'm very concerned about the powers and funding that Victoria's IBAC has at the moment. It needs more power and it needs secure funding so it can do its job. I'm very passionate about IBAC because I worked in the government under Ted Baillieu and then under Dennis Napthine that introduced IBAC.
So what responsibility do you take, though, if you worked in that government and set up the framework, that some of these reports can't come out and the threshold of public hearings is too low? What responsibility do you take?
None, because those laws were changed in 2019 by the Andrews Labor government. They actually weakened the ability and powers of IBAC to conduct public hearings. And I made public comments at the time that I thought that was the wrong thing to do, because Victoria's IBAC, unlike, say, New South Wales, where its ICAC can sometimes become mired in controversy over whether it is overshooting the runway and does harm to people whose reputations have never been in question.
It also scalps the number of sitting premiers and party leaders. Victoria, here in Victoria, that hasn't done that at all.
Well, we've had concerns about what the winding back of its powers has done, and we certainly opposed that when that happened, and we've been calling for a long time for IBAC's funding to be secured.
Just on the Liberal Party and bringing more people in that you obviously want, is it time for genuine quotas for women?
I think the question of quotas in the Liberal Party has always been a vexed one, because there are two competing objectives. The desperate need to get more women into Parliament as Liberal members of Parliament, against the, if you like, enduring principle inside the party that merit prevails and that we have a pre-selection process where the members decide without any dictate. Now, I think increasingly that imperative of trying to get more women into Parliament is becoming a more powerful refrain inside the party. It's certainly one I support. As for whether quotas would ever get up, I've said previously when asked about this, and it's still my view, that I'm not sure that quotas would get support on the floor of State Council.
Why don't you think it will get up on the floor of State Council?
Because the clock is ticking, and we've been talking about quotas for many years, and my main concern... Because I think it's really important that we get more women into Parliament.
Is it time for Matthew Guy to leave Parliament?
I hope not. I actually think Matthew has a contribution to make. It's his call, I understand that, and I fully respect that. But I think he's a person of enormous talent, and if, as I hope, he does stay, there's an enormous role he can play in helping us win government, but also, more importantly, in winning government, the role he could play inside the government, whether it be in public transport, designing policies that put Victoria on a pathway where no matter where you live in the state, you are connected to the rest of the state. And I know he's very passionate about those things.
So would you bring him back into Shadow Cabinet?
I would look at that if he wanted to, of course. He's a person of enormous talent. He's led the party twice, and I know he has a lot of knowledge and experience, and I hope we can continue to tap into that.
But I guess if you want to do that, doesn't that go against rebuilding completely?
Not necessarily.
Why not?
Because you need a blend. In any process of rebuilding and rejuvenation, you need a blend of new talent with experience and knowledge.
Two final questions. Have you spoken with Daniel Andrews since the election?
We've had a very brief and pleasant exchange. at a couple of functions, I think, before Christmas. But look, he's got a job to do, I've got a job to do. I'm focused on what I need to do in terms of being a leader, but also a colleague to my other team members inside the party room, and I'll work with them.
And how do you make the Liberal Party electable again?
We will be electable again. We will do everything we can to win in 2026. As I said at the top of our discussion, it's about how well we connect with and express the aspirations, the will and the hopes of the people we want to represent. And in any election, no matter what differences of analysis you might read and encounter, the ultimate enduring truth of any election outcome is how well did the parties competing in that election reflect the people they want to serve. So for me, it is local, local, local.
But just to pick you up on that though, did the party not reflect the people it wanted to serve, and is that why you lost for a third election?
I think by definition, Simon, if you've lost 3 elections in a row, you have to be realistic. And I would never insult our viewers' intelligence by trying to say it's anything other than that. We lost 3 elections because we didn't reflect the people as well as the government did. So we're going to make sure that by 2026 we're going to be a strong opposition, that we're going to do everything we can to ensure that people look at us and say we're the government that they prefer.
Thanks for your time.
And my pleasure, Simon. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.